The first thing we're going to talk about, well, just Candida viruses, fungus. What are they? How do they enter our body? How do we deal with it? And like I said, it's a totally different philosophy and a way of thinking than what you're used to out there. We're going to talk about antibiotics, what those do, and we're going to start back at the beginning. We're going to kind of lay a foundation and talk about some of these researchers that studied these things back in the day, back in the mid-1800s, because pretty much everybody's heard of Louis Pasteur, right? Okay, Louis Pasteur is pretty famous. That's what we named pasteurization after. But what we don't hear a lot about is Louis Pasteur's colleague. I wouldn't call him a friend, but it was Antoine Virchow. And Antoine Virchow wasn't really Louis Pasteur's friend because he completely disagreed with everything Louis Pasteur believed in. He had a completely different philosophy when it came to health and healing, when it came to microbes and these organisms, viruses, fungus, bacteria, things of that nature. And as we know, Louis Pasteur is famous for theorizing that germs cause infection, cause illness, cause disease. And his colleague, Antoine Virchow, said, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. My research shows that these organisms actually change within themselves. In other words, a bacteria becomes a virus, becomes a fungus, and can go back to a bacteria, back to a virus, and back to a harmless organism. Unfortunately, at the time, he didn't really have the medical technology to prove that. But we will find as we go through here that it was later proved by another doctor, German doctor named Hinderlein. So, the differences in theories basically is the germ theory of disease versus what's known as the cellular theory of disease. And basically what Virchow was saying, it's not so much the organism invading our body that's the problem. The problem is the terrain, okay? The terrain inside of our bodies. So what is terrain? Okay, if we were standing here in this room, what's our terrain? Anybody? The light, the air, the temperature, that's the terrain here. So we have obviously a terrain inside of our bodies. And Virchow theorized that it's based on that terrain inside of our bodies which determines whether or not we get sick, whether or not determines whether we get a microbe or a virus or a bacteria or a fungus or other of these types of organisms in our body. The other thing that's really important to understand is that they say now, based on research, that we have 10 trillion cells in our body. Okay, whatever. Who came up with that? I have no idea. I don't know how you can even measure that. But what we do know is that most of those trillions are not actually cells. They're actually organisms. They're actually living bacteria. Okay, so if we have 10 trillion cells, we actually have about 1 trillion cells and about 9 trillion living bacteria in our system. So we live symbiotically with these types of organisms on our skin, inside our body. You know, you did a little microscope of 1 square inch of your body, you got millions of little organisms living there. I know people freaky and they think it's gross or whatever, but it is what it is. We live with these types of organisms. We have for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Okay, so the important thing we want to figure out is, when does it turn into a problem? When does it turn into an infection? And how do we fix it? How do we deal with it? And as always, if anybody ever has any questions, just raise your hand and we'll answer it immediately. I love questions. I don't like to feel like I'm just standing up here monotone talking. So, interesting, and there's no proof behind this, and I even put this because I don't ever say anything to make it sound like what we believe is true necessarily, because I believe everybody should discern information for themselves. Information should be free and you should be able to make your own decisions. What they say happened is that on Louis Pasteur's deathbed, he admitted, you were right, the germ is nothing, the terrain is everything. So you'll see that floating around the internet if you look it up. But the fact of the matter is there's no proof behind that. Louis Pasteur did write an autobiography, and that's not written in his autobiography. So there's no way to know if Louis Pasteur actually kind of recanted on his deathbed, so to speak, and admitted that some of his colleagues were correct in that. So going back to the terrain. just to give you some examples that make sense, one thing I think of, so think of your body when we're thinking of examples, okay, and what's going on inside your body. Think of a swimming pool, okay? I'm not a big fan of chlorine, of course, but chlorine is a disinfectant, and if you have a chlorinated pool, you're not going to have any organisms living in that pool. As soon as you stop taking care of that pool, what's the first thing that happens? Green stuff starts to grow, right? Whatever that stuff is, it's green and it's nasty, and if you keep letting it grow, it might be brown and it might be orange and it might turn all kinds of funky colors. These are all different kinds of living organisms. If you let it go long enough, what's going to happen? Mosquitoes are going to start to lay eggs in there, and mosquitoes are going to start to hatch, so you're going to have a mosquito problem. Speaking from experience, from a house I had in Las Vegas, long story. But this is what happens inside of our bodies. If we let the terrain of our bodies get to this point, it will be a breeding ground for these types of organisms. And then what's interesting is Antoine Béchamp actually did the cat study. Some of you might have been in the class before where I talked about the Pottinger Cat Study, but the Pottinger Cat Study was actually done before by Béchamp, but it was where he fed cats raw foods, the same exact foods, but one was raw and one was cooked. And the cats that were fed raw foods continued to have healthy kittens generation after generation with no health problems. And the kittens that were fed cooked foods, the first year seemingly no problems, but then started to degenerate after that. And by the third generation, the cats were infertile. They could no longer have kittens. And then I put a little note in there. It's no wonder why most cancer diets, if somebody has some type of a cancer, involves eating raw living foods. Because what does that do? That fixes the terrain. It's all about the terrain inside of our bodies. Any questions so far? No? Do I sound like I'm crazy yet? All right. That's a good start. What, did I hear yet? Okay. So we kind of, based on Pasteur's work, we kind of, I shouldn't say kind of, I mean it's pretty obvious that we still follow this theory, because it is a theory, that germs cause infection, they cause illness. Now, you can't really deny that it's kind of a slippery slope, so to speak, because, for example, there was an intern back in the 1800s, and what was happening is they were in these hospitals, the mortality rate of pregnant women who were in the hospitals having children was through the roof. Like 1 in 4 women were dying in childbirth, and they couldn't figure out why. They were trying everything. And this intern said, well, maybe we should wash our hands. And of course we would laugh about that now, but maybe we should wash our hands. And all the doctors said, oh, that's whatever, we've been practicing this way forever, da, da, da. He's like, no, really, I think you should wash your hands, before you work with these women. Doctors started washing their hands, boop, no more women dying. So, obviously, the germ can invade the body, but my point in telling you all of this is that, based on the two different theories, what's most important is dealing with the terrain, okay, and not being scared of the organism. Okay, we'll get into more of that later, so it makes more sense. So, modern medicine focuses on this now, and pretty much all their practices, is killing and destroying the invading organism. So, you go to the doctor, bacterial infection, yeast infection, sinus infection, doesn't matter what you have, what do they give you? Antibiotics. What other choice do they have? Nothing. They got nothing else in their arsenal. They give you antibiotics, that's it. Some people go and they have a flu, and they give them antibiotics, which is worthless because it doesn't help, but they don't really have any other option to give you. So, and it's not just with these types of issues with antibiotics. It's the same thing with cancer. We have cancer. What do? Let's go in and kill the cancer. Evil cancer. We're going to talk a little bit more about actually what cancer is. But we're set on this mindset of eradicating these things in our body. And what we'll come to understand is that trying to eradicate or kill something never brings about health. There's a pretty interesting quote here under this, in the second page that says, germs do not cause disease. Rudolf Virchow, he's known as the father of pathology, said, if I could live my life over again, I would devote it to proving that germs seek their natural habitat, which is diseased tissue, rather than being the cause of the diseased tissue. I.e., mosquitoes seek stagnant water, but do not cause the pool to become stagnant. Okay? So again, germs, bacteria, things like that, yes, they exist. Yes, they cause problems in our body, but they seek an environment in which they can live, reproduce, and thrive. So what's most important is taking care of that terrain, which I'll be very repetitive on that over and over. They give you an example in here under this same section, germs do not cause disease. Nature has natural mechanisms for life. We have life, we have death, we have decay, and then we have life again. That's the natural cycle of life, right? So the example is if you take a piece of cheese and you take a banana and you let them sit out on your counter for 3-5 days or whatever. Obviously, we know this doesn't work with McDonald's Happy Meals and things. But if you did it with those types of foods, it would start to grow organisms. It would grow fungus and molds and things like that. The difference is when you cut open the banana, it's completely rotted from the inside out. Why? Because it's a living food. Cheese, you can cut the mold off the top and it's still good. Now, maybe some of us wouldn't eat it still, but some of us do. Because there's nothing wrong with the cheese underneath. The mold's growing on top. That's because it's dead. It's not a living food. So the banana decays faster because it's a living food, and that's nature's process of recycling things. Okay, and that's going to become important later as we talk about why we have these things in our body. What's trying to be recycled in our bodies.